Welcome everyone to the fourth session and the final session for the first day of the festival. Thank you ever so much for everyone coming in, and I realize we'll have people coming in throughout the next 15-20 minutes anyways, or throughout the session. The session is entitled Talking Race from Discomfort to Disruptive Action in Research and Teaching, and it's organized by the Racial Justice Working Group. I will hand over to Listra, who's chairing and running the session, and to the speakers. I look forward to the discussion today. Thank you so much.
Hi, colleagues, and welcome this evening to, I suppose in some ways, it's good that Gunjan has put us at the end of the evening, because we sort of wanting to have a little bit more of a discussion and a reflection on the politicizing of race rather than whether say that race exists, because we're starting on that premise, that, there is structural racism, micro racism, and macroaggressions, and there's constant negotiations between ourselves, our political selves, our academic selves, and our philosophical sense. So I thanks colleagues for joining us, and I know we've had some really stimulating conversations that took place both this morning with the keynote and later on with the two other sessions around global power and issues around Palestine that was taking place. So in some ways, the conversation continues to be, as I say, those kinds of conversations that, are both intellectual and emotive as well. So I want to start with that to say that, and to have all those sensitivity issues that I know Gunjan, in terms of, starting the day, has talked about in terms of respect for each other, the ability to agree to disagree, and to also understand that it is within that context that we all will be speaking from. How we intend to do this session, I will start with a very short introduction about, a little bit about the Racial Justice Working Group and my own work. And then I will introduce my four other panel members, which I think you all can see on the screen. So we will then I will introduce everybody up front, and then we will go in the order that I've introduced them. So what will happen, I will then come back at the end once the last panelists have spoken, and we'll open it up for questions. And I know there's a Q&A, there's a Q&A, what do you call it, link that's there that people can start to, to begin to ask questions. And to engage in the discussion, because as I said, we want to have sort of a conversation, and as we talk, I want us to also be reflective of ourselves and race and how it impacts upon us in those categories that I've defined. So without further ado, that's how we intend to work the session, and I'll begin really. And in terms of how I want to begin, let me get the slides up. Brilliant.
Sorted.
Okay, yes. So the panel members, and I can see some of also some of the Racial Justice Working Group in the audience. The Racial Justice Group really was started, yes, I see some hearts, in this SPC, which is Social Policy and Criminology, really coming out of our own reflections as a few of us, many of us really, post the George Floyd type of thing, when we looked at the OU and had concerns around, how we were discussing race, and that we should be, be more visible in terms of understanding and beginning to think of collating, having a group of us who research race, who wanted to include issues around race and racial justice into our teaching, into our conversation with our colleagues. And this is conversation with our white colleagues, conversation with our non-white colleagues, and, in terms of the institution and the representation of issues around race in our teaching, our learning, and our research. So if these race, because race spreads across, all of it. Even in my own work, I have found that even though I started looking at race in the criminal justice system, I now look at race in terms of Black women leadership in higher education, the recruitment of Black and ethnic minority students with regard to recruitment, and also looking at race in terms of issues around death and dying, which we will hear about later from one of Jane, one of our panel members. Now, really, in terms of understanding race, for me, I want to be contrary to Frank Fanon, and I default that my mission really is to educate about race, because for me, I speak about the theme of visibility versus invisibility. Race for me is visible as well as having issues around invisibility. And those two themes and concepts are constantly being negotiated, both in terms of my lived experiences, in terms of my academic discipline experiences, and in terms of researching and teaching race. And so if it's uncomfortable for me, I suspect it's also uncomfortable for other colleagues who might have to deal with these sorts of issues. And really, in terms of understanding race, in terms of the visibility of it, there is always this, this conscious or unconscious bias that, you either need to be there to represent your race because you're in a minority, and you also have to be concerned with ensuring that, certain groups are always represented and being visible. And this is when I talk about, it's both having an emotional and professional impact in terms of the construction of race. And I referred there to Morgan and Bengal's study that found that many people of color in academia are often overworked due to the extra responsibilities they have to undertake outreach work and to represent the ethnic minority to which they belong. And these are not only in terms of indigenous academics, but the importance of, particularly around decolonizing the curriculum, looking at Southern criminology and Southern, post-colonial and coloniality, which are some of the issues we will look at today. But to do that, I also think that we need to be disruptive in terms of calling it out and really bringing to our consciousness those kinds of discomfort. I give an example of, the discomfort of feeling left out, and we're left out in the structure. And this is where one of our panelists, Steve Toombs, was going to be here. Professor Steve Toombs was going to be here this afternoon, was talking about race being left out in the example of the Grenfell Tower disaster in 2017. And race being left out is part of the invisibility of race. Because although it exists, if we leave it out, then there's comfort that, that particular nuance and that particular complexities are not included. But as I say, race stretches across. We cannot not politicize it, regardless of what our race is. So therefore, we need to call it out. We need to be able to address it, and we need to bring the invisibility of the negotiations into being visible. And I think this is where we want to start and end our conversation this afternoon, which is a continuing conversation. So if your research work, if your research work involves race, regardless of what your discipline is, we offer, as our mission statement here on the screen, this is, that anyone, if this, our mission statement engages with you, I do ask you, to join us in terms of creating compassion for working in race, engagement in advocacy, and promoting best practice here at the OU. So that's open to you. The other thing that I also want to offer you as another opportunity for advocacy is that, we've just had approved in the OU the formation of a Black Women's Academy. And if you're interested in joining up, you identify and would like to be involved in that, there's an information and sign-up sheet. And we're due to have our launch hopefully in the autumn this year. Now to introduce the panelists. The idea here is for us to begin at the beginning, so in some ways, because I think Dr. Eleni Dimou will come and she will talk about race and civilization, and she's going to go back to the 18th century and bring us into where we are now in terms of those politicizing dynamics as to the contextual issues which we're having. And I think that's coming nicely after the issues are wrong, what is happening now in our society with regard to wars, with regard to the new enemy, which is Russia, or how the discursive practice is taking place, that again, we're pitting one group against another. And we're no longer talking peace, but we're talking war. Then Dr. Jane McCarthy will come, who is an honorary associate in social policy, again, also part of the Racial Justice Working Group. She's also a visiting professor at the Center of Debt and Society, and also at the University of Reading, and who has for many years worked in terms of, she would refer to herself as being an advocate, but also a thinker in the areas of the silence of different types of conversations and the difficulty and discomfort of some conversations, particularly around death and dying. Then we would have Dr. Ayubami Lori, who is in economics, or a staff tutor and lecturer in economics, and he's going to talk about lived experiences of racism and within the context of being a lecturer and academic in economics at the Open University, and talking around the silences of that. And finally, we'll have Dr. Claire Malcolm, who is going to talk to us about her lived experience and her research in the area of race denial and the obfuscation of race in the society with regard to being a parent, and also with a colleague, how her research has come out of her lived experience and how that lived experience can be impacting our discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Dr. Eleni Dimou to, I will stop sharing and you start sharing, and if you can take us through. Thank you so much again, all colleagues who have agreed to do this.
Perfect. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me, Listra, and the organizers to speak in this panel. It's a great honor, and I think I can speak for all of us that we all look forward to the session, and we hope that you will all enjoy it. So my talk today, as Listra said, will be mainly exploring the notions of race and civilization, and how these constructs have served as a powerful discourse to legitimize a variety of historical and contemporary harms like colonialism, exploitation, extractivism, and genocide. So yeah, just to begin with, just to also mention in terms of warning of the content, that towards the end of the presentation, there may be images that may be upsetting to some people. So just to give you a heads up on this. But just going back to the notions of race and civilization, both notions emerged during the 18th century and were constructs that were shaped by the Enlightenment and imperial ideologies. In turn, also, these constructs were produced and legitimized the foundations for the shaping of colonial, national, and racial hierarchies, both globally and locally. So according to Elizabeth Quinn and other historians, long before the term civilization was coined and gained prominence during the 18th century, societies used a wide range of concepts to distinguish themselves from other populations. However, these earlier concepts were not based on ideas of developmental progress in describing a universal and really linear ladder of advancement as it happened during the 18th century through the modern Western notion of civilization. So, for example, while binaries between us and them existed in ancient Greece and Rome, when they were speaking, for example, about the barbarians, this distinction did not mean a cultural superiority in the modern civilizational sense of Greeks over other populations, but rather the term barbarian, so the term barbarian was not used to denote that these populations were uncivilized, but rather that they spoke a different language and did not follow Greek customs. So for Herodotus, for example, in Histories, he argues that each people's customs are right in their own eyes and no universal standard of culture can be imposed. He even admired certain non-Greek customs, suggesting for a more fluid, receptive, open, and exploratory engagement rather than one grounded on cultural supremacy. So what is really important is to understand that the term barbarians, savages, and primitives in a racialized, derogatory way started being used during the European colonial expansion from the 15th century to the 18th centuries by Western anthropologists and social scientists who joined the colonial project in order to study, measure, compare, categorize, and rank the natural environment as well as the populations that they were encountering. So racialized theories of civilization began to emerge at that point that started to spread, with Western civilization positioning itself at the top of human development. So it's from this point onwards that not only do we have the construction of race, but also its weaponization and mutation into ideas of cultural or civilizational difference. So in a bit more detail, upon the first major colonial encounter in the Americas in the 15th century, colonizers built a set of social systems to secure and legitimize control over colonized and enslaved populations, as well as nature. So humans were categorized from superior to inferior through the fictional concept of race. And knowledge here was very, very important because it was used to legitimize such categorizations by producing a dichotomic template of initially what was understood as Christianity. So colonizers had souls, whereas the colonized and enslaved populations had not. And later with what was understood as the Enlightenment, so particularly through the Cartesian split that I will speak about shortly, where colonizers possessed reason in contrast to the enslaved and colonized populations. These binaries also established an anthropocentric perception of life on the planet, with non-human animals and nature rendered inferior due to the later being perceived as void of soul or reason. So for Maldonado Torres argues that the Cartesian ego cogito, so the rational self, so I think therefore I am, which is said to be the defining characteristic of the modern European self, was founded through and by the ego conquiro, so the self as a conqueror. So it was the very relationship between the colonizer and the colonized which provided a new module to understand the relationship between the soul or mind and the body. So essentially, the Cartesian split constructed binary opposites that came to constitute, first of all, what it means to be human. So man versus woman, mind versus body, human versus nature, reason versus nature. And also these frameworks of knowledge produced and consolidated what the colonial scholars call the logic of separation through the construction of these distinct dualities. So civilization over barbarism, in racialized, of course, developmental terms, in this case, colonizers over the colonized, man over woman, mind over body, reason over emotions, humans over nature, and non-human animals. So the establishment of these Western frameworks of knowledge required, in turn, the silencing and erasure of knowledges and ways of being of the colonized and enslaved people as part of establishing Western European civilization across the colonies. So this dichotomic template and logic of separation was necessary in turn for capitalism expansions, as it paved the way and legitimized the exploitation of those rendered inferior and expendable to secure increasing division of the world, where European to secure increasing profits in planetary commerce. And of course, from what I've said earlier, those rendered inferior and expendable were the colonized and enslaved populations, but also nature and non-human animals. So the conquest of capitalist the consequent capitalist hierarchical economic division of the world, where European powers exploited the labor, products, and natural resources stemming from the colonies, required a legal and political system that would maintain and reinforce this order. And that was the construction of the nation state and its institutions. Now, here of a very particular interest in the impact of the West modern civilisational logic is the doctrine of terra nullius, meaning nobody's land. So the Roman doctrine was revived during European colonial law to justify the appropriation of land not governed by a civilized sovereign. So the Christian and philosophical binaries, which defined Europeans as rational and possessing a soul, could therefore rule over people, whereas the rest were irrational, had no soul, were closer to nature, and as such required ruling over to be civilized into the standards of Western civilization. So for Enlightenment thinkers and imperial powers, societies could only possess civilization if they had private property, a recognized political authority in the sense of monarchies or states, Christian religion and law. So if societies were not recognized as having civilization, religion, law, or ownership in the European terms and standards, their lands was designated as legally empty, even if it was inhabited by indigenous populations. So colonized and enslaved populations, as mentioned, were being animalized out of humanity and hence constructed as uncivilized and incapable of sovereignty. So what happened is that their civilizational status, the supposedly inferior civilizational status was mutated into land rights, with colonizers grabbing and claiming land without treaties, compensation, or recognition, because they were bringing civilization to what was perceived as primitive or savage populations. So we have all these interlocking components of a colonial system that rationalized and justified racial violence and mass extermination in the name of civilization and progress. So the civilizing missions mutated as well with the passing of time into modernization missions or contemporary discourses and practices of development. And we have Western civilization and logics rendering colonized and enslaved populations as biologically and morally inferior, savage, primitive, pre-modern, or underdeveloped that need constantly discipline, correction, replacement by settler colonists, or even attempts at erasure, particularly when their continued existence or presence are defined as an obstruction or threat to the colonial project. So the erasure of the legal and ontological existence of indigenous people as being worthy of recognition and protection legally enabled physical genocide, so massacres, forced starvation, removal of those obstructing the settler colonial projects, as well as cultural genocide, so residential schools, removal of children, suppression and erasure of languages, and local traditions of knowledge, and also as well forced conversion into Christianity, among others. So as Cesar puts it, Nazism is not to be seen as an aberration from the march of progress, but a logical development of Western civilization itself. It was only when the inhumane colonial procedures shaped by capitalism and racism were applied to white populations in Europe that they shocked the world and were eventually defined as crimes against humanity. Up to then, genocides and genocidal logics carried out against indigenous and African populations have been memorialized, not criminalized, with monuments erected in their honor, much like those glorifying Queen Victoria, British slave traders, or Spanish monarchs, effectively masking the genocidal destruction under the banner of expanding the Western modern civilization. So this political, legal, epistemological, and economic architecture rooted in colonialism did not dissolve with the formal end of colonization. Instead, it has been institutionalized and globalized through the construction of the modern state and its institutions, and currently through the supranational and international bodies. As such, while colonialism has formally ended, according at least to global north dominant historical discourses and accounts, coloniality has not disappeared. So coloniality is the everyday presence of colonialism in the present. It is ubiquitous and has been exacerbated by the violence embedded in constructs such as the binaries of civilization versus barbarism, or more recently, Huntington's piece on the class of civilization, which still permits global politics. So one of the most recent manifestations of this ongoing coloniality that can be seen in discourses by officials of the settler colonial regime of Israel to justify the genocidal treatment and forced starvations of Palestinians. I've picked some of them here. There are a lot, but we have Benjamin Netanyahu stating it's a clash between barbarism and civilization, between those who glorify death and those who sanctify life. We are facing monsters who murder children in front of their parents. This is a battle not only of Israel against these barbarians, it is a battle of civilization against barbarism. Similarly, Yoav Gallant quoted, there will be no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything will be closed. We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. Similarly, Bezalel Smotrich, there is no such thing as a Palestinian nation. There is no Palestinian history. There is no Palestinian language. And the deputy speaker of the Israeli parliament, Nassim Baturi, stated that no one in the world wants the civilians in Gaza. Everyone is pushing them to Israel. They know that these are scum and subhumans. So we can clearly see here the weaponization of the Western logic of civilization through the civilization versus barbarism binary, where any notion of Palestinian legal and ontological existence is being erased. The savage Palestinian is looked at as a subhuman wild creature that needs to be controlled through assault, violence, surveillance, a siege beyond proportion, reproducing in turn the doctrine of terra nullius. So with the supposed higher civilizational status of Israel acting as an extension of the imperial West in the region, being automatically translated into land rights, with colonizers grabbing and claiming land by any means, even by forcibly removing populations, ethnically cleansing them, eliminating them and their culture through a total destruction of university schools, mass killings of scholars, poets, journalists, the ethnic cleansing of the civil population, the majority of which are children, forced starvation and utter devastation and elimination of the Gaza Strip in its entirety, for it then to be used for development projects of Zionist settlements or tourist rivieras, as we have recently heard in the area. So perhaps what I could see that is different in terms of the genocidal colonial logics of the West manifested currently by the Zionist Israeli regime is that its actions are live streamed 24/7. So populations across the world, in contrast to their governments, can see the hypocrisy of what was up to now hidden behind the discourses of Western democracy, civilization, and equal rights for all. They can see the double standards in the adherence of international law and the importance of racism in its application. So to conclude, the ongoing annihilation of Palestine is not a deviation from the Western civilizational ideals. It is actually their logical unfolding. The same structures and discourses that legitimize slavery, dispossession, and genocide are now deployed in full view. So to stand with Palestine is to resist the very logics of Western civilizations, of the logic of separation and racism that have justified centuries of domination and gross manifestations of harm. With the current crackdown on freedom of speech for people who oppose this ongoing genocide, it has become evident that if the Palestinian people can be stripped of their humanity with impunity, then the meaning of freedom, democracy, and rights for people across the world is at stake and is at risk of becoming an empty shell. So that is why I'm arguing that Palestine is the moral compass of our time, and if Palestine is not free, none of us will be free. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess, and thanks for being fairly timely, Eleni. Well done. Thank you so much. On to our next speaker, who is Dr. Jean McCarthy.
Just saying thank you, and I'm really honoured to be invited to be part of this panel, and I hope you can see my slides okay. Great, that's fantastic. And actually, thank you to Eleni for that incredibly powerful presentation. I would regard that as a tour de force, to be honest. And I hope that what I'm going to talk about follows on quite significantly from what you're saying, because I think what part of what you were getting at is the incredible interconnections between all these different threads and these different facets of the modern world. And that's kind of what I'm building on. So I'm talking about what is known as an open societal challenge, which we have had going for a few years now in development under the title of existential disconnection. And they're called challenges, and I think part of what I'm going to talk about today is just how challenging the conversations are around the themes that we're interested in. So I'm going to kind of go through fairly quickly the different aspects of what we're concerned with, that we're trying to connect up with, and why each of those raises very difficult conversations. And again, as we've been saying so far already, that these are sensitive issues and they are difficult conversations because they are very difficult, sensitive topics. But I suppose I'm also going to be suggesting that that's the very reason we need to talk about them. This next slide is pretty well redundant because of the presentation we've had from Eleni, but it is trying to encapsulate visually very quickly the themes that we're interested in. So on the one hand, we're talking about the existential threat of mortality. We're talking about death, loss, and change. On the other hand, we're also talking about the existential threat of the climate and ecological emergency and the threats that poses to life on Earth. But the really key issue is that those two areas of work, which are currently pretty well disconnected, they both have to be understood, and the connections have to be made through a decolonizing perspective. And that's where this whole issue about modernity becomes so incredibly important. Which Eleni has set out for us so beautifully, really. But what I would add to that is that modernity itself colonial modernity is itself the root of the climate and ecological emergency. It's absolutely the source of it. So it's part of it. It's another thread that comes woven through all these other things. And also that the processes of othering mean that we lose compassion. And Eleni saying that if Palestine is not free, then the rest of us are not free. If we lose our human values, then they're lost to all of us. So in terms of difficult conversations, and I'm not going to provide answers today, I think the first thing we have to do is recognize just how difficult the conversations are. But one of the other things that I would like to stress about coloniality, modernity, and the othering that occurs through that is that sometimes I think there's a danger that people might think more about the structural and political issues of modernity, but in thinking about how it impacts on people, then it's maybe more the cultural issues that come forward. The emphasis on rationality, the realist ontology, the emphasis on science and individual autonomy and inner life, and and the narrative that this is going to lead to everlasting human progress. So that's the backdrop for everything, the themes that we're trying to connect. So if I move on, oh, that works. Right, so the first dangerous conversation, which I put at the heart of today's session, is the one of race. And I'm using an interview here that was published between George Yancey and in response to, he had written a letter which he published in the New York Times entitled Dear White America. This was in 2019. Oh, the interview was in 2019, his letter was in 2015. And he received the most incredible backlash, really, really extensive backlash. And what he's talking about in this interview is how difficult it is to have conversations about race. So he says that he wanted to encourage white people to cultivate a sense of white self-criticality, to augment white consciousness, to encourage white people to identify ways in which they suffer from an epistemology of ignorance and bad faith. In this sense, pedagogy ought to be dangerous. It ought to be dangerous because it can function as a process of loss and fundamental transformation, which can be a very dangerous process, especially if it means losing assumptions and embodied habits that help to buttress hegemonic systems. Now, he's a philosopher, and this is what he hopes that philosophy can achieve. Philosophy dares to engage questions that speak to who and what we are, how we have failed ourselves, and what we might become. It dares to challenge power structures that are firmly in place. It dares to demask, which also includes removing the masks that I hide behind. In other words, he's saying that he's not excluding himself from these issues. You see, that can be painful. That involves suffering as we begin to learn about ourselves and our complicity regarding the suffering of others. Thinking philosophically makes me lose sleep. It forces me to face forms of responsibility that I would rather not see. And that part of what he was trying to say in his letter to Dear America was for white people to really take on board how much we are implicated, and I'm using the word we advisedly, how much we are implicated in the perpetuation of racism and all the systems and the issues that go with that. But he also suggests that this act of truth-telling functions to liberate us all. And that's the really positive, productive hope. So moving on to the next thread of our concern, death and its aftermath. And one of the things that tends to happen around, quite often when you read an article or a piece about death, people will start by saying death is a universal experience, which I would actually question. And again, this becomes relevant to a quote from Yancey, that embedded within that notion of universality is white narcissism, a form of white nativism. And this next quote comes from Ajari, and he's particularly pointing out the significance of death in relation to race. He says that a death-centered definition of racism alludes to conceptualizations of the Black experience as marked and affected by the proximity of death. But in terms of how we start to try and disentangle that, I've given you a quote here from Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, drawing on her own indigenous heritage. So she's challenging modernity, and she's raising a really important issue here, that death is a huge challenge to modernity. So she says modernity emerged as an attempt to control change and to resist and defeat death. Societies that see death and life as integral to each other have processes and protocols of coordination and preparedness to deal with the inevitability of change, pain, loss, and death. that are unimaginable within modernity. That's a very strong statement to absorb, actually. And then speaking from a different position, Arthur Kleinman, who's an American psychiatrist, but also an anthropologist, he makes this statement: it is our assiduous denial of existential vulnerability and limits that is extraordinary. It is as if modernity itself were predicated on fostering this fiction of falsehood at the center of global culture. And then this last quote comes from Peter Thiel, who is the billionaire PayPal founder, and it's a quite extraordinary quote. He says, "I stand against confiscatory taxes, totalitarian collectives, and the ideology of the inevitability of the death of every individual." And that, in a way, is where the logic of modernity would end up. We can defeat death, apparently. So in terms of decolonizing death and its aftermath, we need to expose the whiteness of death and its aftermath in the ways that it's understood within colonial modernity. And this leads to a need not only for epistemological, but also ontological justice. It's actually about the nature of reality and how far does modernity limit our capacity to understand and engage with other forms of being in the world that come from elsewhere. So we need a notion of pluriversality, not universality. And then we come to the third thread, dangerous conversations around climate and ecological emergency. And I've got here a quote. You see, I rely very heavily on quotes from other people, but they say it so beautifully. This is from Feluke Taylor, who's an unruly therapist, is how one might describe her. She's talking about after the end of the world. She said, "I read an article about new forms of grief arriving in therapy rooms. Grief that is not connected to an individual loss, but a sense that the earth is doomed. This grief is not new, reminds us, as Catherine Yusuf does, that to name this era Anthropocene and worry about the earth's doom in a future tense is to fail to see, to be silent about the extinctions already undergone by Black and Indigenous people. Worlds ended over and over again, not new. Colonialism, racial capitalism, climate change, and the death of a planet are connected catastrophes, are shared conditions even when not seen or seen late by those not yet living in the rubble." And a quote from a poem, a little extract from a poem by Ben Okri. He says that we are the not so slow suicide of the world. So having set out these interlocking, dangerous conversations, I just wanted to finish very briefly with an example of where this might take us if we're trying to make connections. And this word grief is so central to the way we talk about so many issues around loss and death, that grief, as we use it today, is an English word, and it doesn't translate directly into many other languages around the world. So the way it's come to be used, its contemporary meaning is that it's referring to an individual, internal, emotional, and psychological process following a death or severe loss. And in fact, recent survey data from Germany found that the majority of people regard grief as a mental illness. If we look at the history of the word, and I've only done this recently because my daughter suggested it, it's extraordinary. From the 13th century, the word grief in French, Old French, referred to wrong, grievance, injustice, misfortune, calamity, and it could be used as a verb to mean to afflict, to burden, and to oppress. And I find that absolutely extraordinary, the way that word has been transformed and what's been lost in the process. But I'm going to finish also with another quote from Yancey. It's about a form of love as a dangerous practice where white people learn how to live without masks. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jane, and also within time. Thank you. Summaries at the end. Ayobami, are you there?
Yes, I'm sharing my slide now.
Okay.
Please let me know if you can see my slide.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Ayuba Milore. I'm a staff tutor in economics. Today, I will be talking about experiencing racism and how silence contributes to some of the things we witness in workplace, particularly for people of color or other Black and minority ethnic groups that work in an area where they are mainly a minority within the system. The first thing I want us to look at today is basically what the structure of racism could look like. Racism is often a multi-level menace. It can be from individual, it can be interpersonal, it can be institutional, and it can even be systemic. And several reports recently conducted by government-sanctioned bodies have found similar things even within some government institutions, and that calls for action, particularly action from people who think that maybe these things doesn't really matter. And another thing about racism is that it is embedded in our social structure. It is not something that probably we think they are just passive and random. They are concrete to our everyday practice and policies, and more reasons why we should pay attention to them. So in my discussion today, mainly, I will be focusing on how silence and denial perpetuate racism. Why, despite several efforts that have been made, and also in line with some of the talk that we've had earlier this afternoon, we still see that we experience racism in different forms and in different ways. So we want to understand why silence and self-denials perpetuate racism within the system. I would like to start with this quote by Gloria Jean Watkins, popularly known as Bell Hooks. It says, "All our silences in the face of racist assaults are acts of complicity." Now, when I first came across this quote, I often take it more as, oh, those who witnessed it and didn't say anything. But in my course of preparing this slide and in my own lived experience, I've realized that even when victims themselves sanction themselves regarding what they think is racism or what they think they have experienced, and because of that, they choose not to take an action, they are simply helping the perpetrator to think it is normal. And this could be problematic. Now, one thing about silence is that it entrenches further silence. And the way it works is that it helps victims to question themselves. It makes victims to think maybe what they have experienced is maybe normal. Maybe it is just accidental, so it is not something they need to drink too much water about. Keeping silent could also mean that they fear maybe a form of social backlash, discomfort, or even discouragement from other people, maybe even people that look like them, people that have probably experienced similar thing. Being in a workplace environment where maybe you met some people that you felt, oh, these people look like me. They probably must have experienced the same thing, and then you express what you have just experienced, and they feel, oh, I think that is just how this person behaves. Just, you don't need to worry about it because there's nothing that is going to come out of it. These kind of discussions only entrenches further silence. And when those silence continues, they make structural changes really difficult in our systems. Another form of silence are those of the bystanders, people who knew what happened, not necessarily because they were comfortable with it, but they were just not sure exactly how to respond. Imagine an ally or someone who professes to be an ally who have just experienced, who have just witnessed what happened, but they are not sure whether the right action to at that point in time is to come and talk to you or to talk to the person. Maybe the person who they notice as being the perpetrator is a senior, or maybe the person have just passively passed a comment and they are not sure how to address those things. But by remaining silent, they are also contributing to the problem indirectly. Because with such silence, the person who perpetrates this racism will take it as normal. And this kind of issue, this kind of silence, they create significant problem within our system. They don't only create problem for the individuals, they also make sure that those kind of things have effects that are probably long lasting and could also have a much wider reach than where that particular problem is arising from. And we've seen this leading to disparities in our healthcare systems, in our education, in employment, housing, and social justice. You could name just a few. Let me just share a few screenshots with you here. The first screenshot on the top left is outcome of a survey conducted by the UCU in 2015 for Black UCU members. And then one of the things...
I'm really sorry to interrupt. I don't know if it's just me, but I can't actually see your slides advancing, so I can't see the screenshots.
Oh, sorry, can everybody see the slides? Oh,
we were key findings here, sorry. Sorry.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Oh, yes. I'm so sorry I've taken this too far. Okay. So the first one on the top left is the outcome of the UCU survey just barely 10 years ago that was reported in 2016. And in this area, we see that within the education system, the staff member, the Black staff member in 16 colleges and university, much of what they think they face within the system are related to promotions and the way they have been treated within the system relating to policies and action within the system. On the right side, on the top right side, we see the outcome of a survey conducted by University UK just last year, 2024, about students. And we see significant amount of racialized students, or shall I say minority students, also report different forms of racism within their own systems. Now, on the bottom left, we see a report also just from last year about racism within the NHS. And we see that the kind of comment that was made here shows that this is not something that we can just overlook. It is something that the NHS needs to get a grip about, because even their own staff are complaining that they experience it, and it is perpetuating a culture of avoidance, of defensiveness, of playing down the incident and lived experience of the people who report these issues. And when we see those kind of comments, we see that it means people are trivializing this issue. Therefore, people think that it is just normal. So let us just keep the status quo in place. At the bottom right is another survey conducted in 2022. Now, this is not in the UK. Now, this is in the US. 1,000 Black Americans and 1,000 white Americans were surveyed by Very Well Health. And these are just reports that some of the Black patients think they observed. I have chosen education both in terms of the staffs and the students, and I've chosen health in terms of both the staff and the patients here, just to help us to see that this is not something that is just random or something that concerns only selected groups of actors. It is something that is much bigger than that. And when we keep quiet about it, when we felt maybe I don't need to report it, whether you are the bystander who witnessed it or you are actually the victim who experienced it, it causes much bigger problems for us. Now, how does this cycle of silence work? There are actually 5 major sections. It starts with the victim experiencing the incidents. And then because of fear of whatever has happened, or maybe there's this ambiguity about what really constitutes racism within a system. We've seen in the news about people making some forms of comments or people experiencing serious racism in place of work, but then the workplace will say, oh, we don't like commenting on certain issues, or the issue is still undergoing investigation just because they felt that it is not right for them to comment on it or to comment on it publicly. And when we take this kind of stand against racism, such stand only helps to perpetuate racism. The fear of speaking out, either because of isolation, retaliation, stereotype, people are concerned. They don't want to be labeled as, oh, the guy that always foment the trouble within the system, or the guy that always take things too seriously. So they simply felt, okay, let me keep quiet about these things. The silence can also be from the bystanders, I've also explained later. So people sanction themselves, or people feel the system has already sanctioned them even before they even witness the incident. So they keep quiet about what they have experienced. And then what then happened is that the racism that has just been perpetrated go unchallenged and become a norm within the system. And we've seen this time and time again in different forms. It might be in form of a microaggression or some form of subtle or unintentional comment or actions, or some form of stereotype of people of color. And
sorry, Ayubami, I just want to say that you have a few minutes more because I'm looking at the time. So
yes, that's okay. And then the final part of this is that we see perceptions about racism becomes rare. People think that probably racism doesn't exist within the system, or maybe it is just, I think there's a way it's just been perpetrated by some minority element within the system, so we don't think it is a problem. And sometimes you see things about people saying, oh, we are colorblind within the system, so we don't believe racism exists within the system. And because of this, the cycle repeats itself. So let me quickly jump to a call for action, and I'll quickly share an experience of my own self. Okay. So what can we do about this? One thing is that we should often acknowledge this when it happens. And I will give an example. In from one of the former places I have worked, I experienced racism in different from particularly microaggressions. And I just felt maybe this is just how these people work, or this is just how they communicate. And I didn't comment on it. And then the thing continues and continues, and it's only make matter worse, particularly for me, because as a person, I probably should have taken action, which I believe I should have by now, and I didn't take those actions. And that personally affected my own growth on that particular job. Another thing, we should encourage open and honest conversation, like what Gunjan and the team at GCSJ are trying to do through this festival, particularly this particular session. We should talk about this kind of issue. We should have an honest discussion, what is really happening and why we think they are happening and how we think we can help to break that particular chain of actions. And we should also try to support and amplify marginalized voices. I remember that my own former line manager, when I joined the OU, has particularly helped in this particular area. When you notice that people are experiencing racism, people are going through some form of action that maybe they themselves have not reported directly, you should talk to them and help to amplify their voice about what they have experienced and what action they could take. And of course, it is a collective responsibility. It is a matter for both the juniors and the seniors. It is a matter for both the people of color and the majority race within the system. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, Claire is at the end. I do want to indulge our audience, to give us a few more minutes because we do want to take questions. Claire, the floor is yours.
This is based on a book that I've co-written with a fellow OU colleague, Mel Green. I will be going through this at lightning speed at this point. But before I do, I would say a huge thank you for having me and a huge thank you to my fellow presenters who've all been amazing and have selfishly set me up rather beautifully for some of the things I want to say. So diving straight into the book is Mothering at the Margins, Black Mothers Raising Autism, advocating for, here it says, but the title is Raising Autistic Children in the UK. And these are the research questions on which it is based. So very quickly, 4 main questions. What are the common experiences of Black mothers in the UK raising autistic children? How do Black mothers perceive and navigate UK healthcare, education and social care systems and services for their autistic children? Question number 3, how do Black mothers perceive the role of racial and or gender identity in their experiences? And the final question, what specific recommendations do Black mothers have for improving healthcare, education, social care systems and services for their autistic children? I realise the other thing I need to apologise for, by the way, is I have terrible hay fever and one of my eyes is watering. So I have a kind of clockwork orange aesthetic going on here where I've got like mascara on one side. I think I'm making it work, but just in case you're wondering what the look is. So how does this relate to the conversation we're having today? What I've done here in true OUAL tradition is I have broken down the title in the way that we encourage our students to when they're writing their essays. So the first issue, race. Clearly this is about race. There's no book without race, without a discussion about race. Mothering at the Margins is explicitly and exclusively concerned, and exclusively is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, with the experiences of Black mothers of autistic children. And you would be astonished at the number of times I've had to justify that to people, because people are very curious as to why I only want to talk about Black women. And my response to that is, because the question is why only Black women, which is what's come up under the discomfort banner. My question is, why not Black women? What is it about our experiences that's not worth talking about? Okay, why do we have to have anyone else involved in the conversation or the focus of the discussion be anything except us? Okay, so yes, unapologetically, this is about the experiences of Black mothers of autistic children. So why only Black women? Well, the key to the project was the prioritization of anti-racism over white comfort, which has been a theme, I think, which has been sort of bubbling under the surface in the other conversations as well. The discomfort is really often when we talk about racism is sitting with white people who are like, oh, I don't like what this sounds like, I don't like what this feels like, I don't like the sense that I'm implicated, that I'm responsible, that I should be doing something that I'm not doing, or I shouldn't be doing something I am doing. This is uncomfortable. Let's deflect, let's change the subject, let's broaden the discussion, let's introduce some whataboutism into it, because surely this isn't just about race. And Io set me up beautifully as well, that diminishing the experience of that gaslighting, changing the subject. We're not doing that. Okay, so the pushback that I've experienced has been unsurprising, but still quite disappointing. Very briefly on this, the research strategy has been a hybridized approach that we've taken between Black feminist thought, critical race studies and critical disability studies. They all have in common this emphasis, again, on the amplification of marginalized voices, which is another reason I've been set up beautifully in this discussion. Mothering at the margins, that's the point. Listening to, amplifying, validating voices that we don't normally get to hear in these kinds of conversations, okay? And then it's the teaching element. Is the book itself is actually a teaching resource. First and foremost, it's designed as a teaching resource for professionals and practitioners in the fields of healthcare, education, and social care. And that's because the disruptive element of it is that is an unapologetically transformative agenda. So it's not just a description. It's not, no one's a tourist in this discussion. It's not a kind of a treatise of just misery, okay, although the misery is very real, there are elements of that. It's not just describing the experience of marginalization, it's a call to action. It's saying, what do we do differently to empower and support and actually listen differently to the people who are affected by racism and marginalization? You can't do any of that unless you're having a conversation about race, unless your main discussion point, your main focus is building on just the acceptance out of the gate that yes, racism exists. Yes, people's experiences are based on the way in which they are racialized, the way in which they experience racial discrimination. That's just treated as a given in this book. It's not really up for discussion. Why do I have skin in the game, both literally and metaphorically, when it comes to this discussion? Well, I have, clearly, as you can see, I'm a Black woman. I also have an autistic child of my own. She is 13, so, you know, life would be tricky anyway at home right now. I think it's fair to say, just with the joys of living with a teenager. But we've got this extra dimension where we're also dealing with a very complex autism presentation. It's a comorbidity with ADHD and with learning difficulties. She also has a brother who is 10 years younger than her. So we are dealing with not just teenage joys, but we're also dealing with three-nager, although he's just turned 4, so this slide does need updating. So a lot going on. And my friend, colleague, and co-author Mel is in a very similar situation. She is raising a child who has a complex autism presentation. His little brother also liable to be autistic, unlikely to receive a diagnosis because his presentation is low support, which is the same story as my son, which is why we came together and used collective autoethnography. Collective autoethnography is a participatory and democratic research methodology distinct from other autoethnographic methodologies in its emphasis on co-constructing narratives. Owing to its focus on shared meaning-making and mutual respect, COAE is well suited to anyone aiming to examine shared experiences within a community or group setting in a qualitative research context. So to sum that up very, very quickly, the reason this works for us, the reason we decided on this as an approach straight away is because we were already having these kinds of conversations. There was an inbuilt authenticity to the way in which we were sharing our experiences, and we wanted to capture that in a research project. There's also a measure of interdisciplinarity because my background is politics, although both Mel and I consider ourselves to be social scientists. My background is politics and IR, Mel's is education. So we had these different perspectives that we could bring together from a disciplinary perspective. The democratizing effect of flattening hierarchies and it just being two people having these conversations and sharing their experiences was very important to us. It also built a sense of solidarity because this is such an emotional subject for us, such a difficult raw type of exchange, that to have each other's back in that way, to be sharing those experiences and also be able to support each other emotionally was very important. And it led to the next step of the research project, which was really all about building a community of resistance. I'm not going to have a lot of time to talk about the second half of the project, of the participant research. I'll give a sort of nod to it, but hopefully you guys will be able to see the slides afterwards and you'll be able to see the direct quotes from our participants because they are very powerful. I'm just not going to have time to rehearse them, unfortunately. It's ironic, really, because I'm all about amplifying the voices. I don't have time to read out the quotes. Didn't want to find myself in that situation, but I don't edit well. So we created our own co-constructed narrative. This is our collective collective autoethnographic narrative. What were the shared experiences that came out of our discussions? We did this in a really basic way. This was basically us transcribing voice memos that we shared with one another over WhatsApp or conversations that we'd had in Teams meetings. It was really just about capturing that authentic, very real lived experience that we had both shared. And we found very quickly into those conversations, I don't know how visible this is, that we had certain commonalities in our experiences. We had both had our parental concerns regarding our children's developmental delays dismissed by healthcare professionals for some considerable time after we broached them. We knew our kids were autistic for quite literally years before anyone would listen. We both experienced racist and the microaggression, doing some work here, that bracket, they weren't all micro, suffice to say. in encounters with healthcare, education, and social care professionals. We've both been made to feel as if our parenting was being called into question, this kind of culture of racialized parent blame by those same professionals, with multiple baseless implied suggestions of neglect, incompetence, or parental irresponsibility. Case in point, me being told that my child's speech delay was probably down to the fact that I wasn't reading to her. I've been reading to her since she was in utero. The none too subtle suggestion that there's research to suggest that autism might be connected with recreational drug use in pregnancy. I think you know where you're going with that. Other suggestions, basically anytime I walked into a room and my husband wasn't with me, there'd be questions of, you know, and is dad in the picture? Is dad around? You know, all that type of thing. And Mel had those same experiences as well. We therefore felt compelled to deputize our husbands, both of whom are white, by the way, to represent our families in meetings and discussions, despite us being objectively better qualified to do so. So my husband, wouldn't mind me telling you this, he left school at 15 with no qualifications. Here's me packing a PhD in 10 years worth of, well, at the time, the 10 years worth of work in academia. I had to give him post-it notes that he could read from so that they would listen, because if I said it, if I was in the room, no one wanted to hear. The flip side to that, when my husband wasn't available, is I had to credentialize myself from predominantly white spaces, basically kick the door in and say, I am Dr. Claire Malcolm and I insist that you listen to me. And here's all my experience and how I know all this stuff. Flip side to that being, of course, I then got accused of being an angry black woman because I was being too aggressive. So we've been faced, because of all this, with no choice but to seek out expensive private healthcare for our children and to buy our way through these biases and through these prejudices. Spoiler alert, didn't work. Thereby increasing a financial burden already generated by our caring responsibilities and their impacts on our career. Colleagues in the room will know that I work part-time. That's not out of choice. That's because I have to be available for my child. We had experienced weathering. I recommend Geronimus's book on this, in the sense that our physical and mental health had been adversely affected by the demands placed on us in supporting our children. You can't go through all this for as long as we have without it making you very, very sick. And there are all manner of statistics about the experiences of chronic illness, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, diabetes, heart disease, all these things. Black women massively overrepresented in all of these things. And that's always based on assumptions about lifestyle or about pre-existing conditions. It's never looked at as being the consequence of structural racism, which is in fact what it is. We had found that our children's behaviour had been labelled in much more negative terms than that of their non-black children in their cohort. And yes, the old faithful, we'd been labelled as angry black women anytime we had that frustration had come to the surface, and we've been advocating for our children, even if we'd done so very respectfully, very calmly, still with the angry black women. Okay, so that's what happened to us. We wanted to know whether that happened to other people, so we created a survey, interviews, focus groups, and we ended up with an incredible group of women who came forward and shared their experiences with us as well. We distilled those experiences into what we termed the triad of oppression and the associated multiplicity of burdens, which looks something like this. Very, very pretty, but incredibly depressing reading. So the triad of oppression consists of the experiences of racism, misogyny, and ableism. All of those things are distilled into what we call the multiplicity of burdens. It's very important to point out that our children are not the burdens in this situation. We do not feel burdened by them. They're the best things that has ever happened to either of us. The burdens are the consequences of having to advocate for them in a hostile and profoundly racist environment. So those burdens are physical in the way that I just described with the weathering. They are psychological, which is just guilt, self-recrimination, gaslighting, just all the sorts of things that you might expect to experience when you feel as if your own racial identity is making it harder for you to give your children what they need. There are cultural burdens. There's always this assumption that there's a delay in black children being diagnosed with autism because the black community doesn't accept the existence of autism. Of course, there's autism denial in certain sections of the black community. Our research pointed to the fact that this was a group of women who would do anything to get their child diagnosed, who would do anything to get the support in place for their kids, and were meeting systemic barriers based on the way they were treated because of their identity, that this was a culture of hostility, a culture of negligence, a culture of systemic racism. There's the practical burden, just the day-to-day reality of trying to advocate for a child who has complex needs, and again, particularly in this difficult environment where their needs are being looked at through the lens of their mother's identity. And the fact that there's a temporal burden because none of this ends. Our kids, because they have complex autism presentations, aren't going to age out of this and at some point be able to advocate for themselves. So this is a commitment that we have it's a lifelong commitment, but it's for the duration of their lives, not for the duration of our lives. And so there's that sense of, well, what happens for them when I'm not here to do this, when I can't advocate. As I warned at the beginning, unfortunately, these very powerful and very important quotes are going to have to just stay in the slides. And it's my hope that anyone who has the time and the inclination will be able to read them. So I'm just going to choose one, which is, no one tells our stories. No one wants to hear our stories. They're not ready to hear our stories. Our voices are so invisible in this space. And that bothers me so much, because how can we change things if we don't know? And I want people to genuinely want to know. That, for me, distills why we need to have conversations about race, why we can't obfuscate, why we can't deny, why we can't gaslight, why we can't minimize, why we can't diminish. We need to have open and frank conversations about the effect that racism continues to have, particularly with those with an intersectional identity that's also linked with gender and proximity to disability, which is the group of people that have been discussed in the book. So going through these quotes much more quickly than I would want to, and ending on what we found out, the answers to our research questions, okay? We looked for common experiences. Were there common experiences? Yes, through a diversity of participants. And when I say diversity, I'm talking about different ages, different locations, different professional roles, different family size, different relational information. All these women were saying the same thing. Mel and I were saying the same thing, granted, but once we opened it up to participant research, we found that these experiences were echoing across our cohort of participants. They all talked, and I mean independently of one another. We did not ask questions that prompted this. We asked open-ended questions. What's your experience been like? Discuss, okay? They all talked about gaslighting, racial profiling and gatekeeping, difficulties in securing support, parental blame and dismissal. And this was cited across the board, all types of practitioners in education, healthcare and social care. A wonderful quote from one of our participants about the perception of navigation of health, education and social care systems described the SEND system in general as being a broken system in which we are fighting for scraps in a broken system. I think that's such a powerful quote, fighting for scraps in a broken system. All parents of SEND kids are doing that, but to add the layer of racialization and racism on top of that makes for an incredibly disheartening and difficult experience. The perception of the role of racial and gender identities, all our participants, ourselves included, identified experiences of our intersectional identities resulting in othering. And our recommendation, and this is a different discussion for a different day, was the creation of a culturally competent and anti-racist one-stop shop, which is for and by Black mothers of autistic children. So to bring it full circle to the importance of acknowledging race, if you don't see race, you don't see racialization, you don't see racism, and therefore you can't surface solutions that will actually work. You have to see race in order to come up with interventions and support systems which are tailored for people who have a particular identity, which is what we have done in our suggestion, that actually there should be a type of provision and a type of service which is accessible to people who have had experiences like the ones that we've had, and we've had those precisely because of our intersectional identity. So without a conversation about race, there's no possible solution for us or for our families or frankly for society at large.